Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I just have a few little opening items that kind of are organizing the event this evening. Just first of all, I'm a rural and environmental sociologist that's very lucky to work here as part of the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology. It's a very special place. And I'm lucky to be back here after 10 years. I graduated here 10 years ago, and equally lucky to be speaking with these two incredible scholars that Annabelle Ibsen's going to be introducing for us in a bit. Just a few things. The lecture is being recorded tonight. We are really excited to have discussion at the end of it, but I just want to give you a heads up that we will be recording it. It's supported by a few great funds. One of them is the MacArthur Foundation that's helping support this through their small grants program, and we're very thankful for that. And they also would love to hear your feedback on how it goes tonight. So if you would like to provide it, in the back of the room, we have a little QR code that you can scan, and some goodie bags for you from our department. So the goodie bag is not dependent upon leaving your evaluation of the event by any means. But it's great. It says C&E Sociology. So we invite you to take one of those. And I also want to give thanks to the Holler family for also helping support this event. Arch Holler was on the faculty of the Department of Rural Sociology. That's what we were called formerly. And he was a professor from 1965 to 1994. And in 1998, the Holler Distinguished Lectureship was established with support from friends and colleagues. Each year, our department has the good fortune to be able to bring in high-profile scholars like we have with us here today. And about those high-profile scholars, they're going to be talking about their new book, which Leopold's Books has for sale in the back of the room. And I think brought along a few straggler books of mine, too. I promise I would say they're back there. So please drop by and see them. We're going to have refreshments that follow the event as well, so you can get something to eat. Please have something. And we have so much bureaucracy. I'm sorry to push a little bit more of that onto you, but if you can sign in so we can help get food reimbursed, that would be great. Thank you, Sarah. It's such a bummer. And last, I don't know if Malika is here. She is. She has the sign-in sheet there with her. Malika Somos in Durham is a miracle worker. We're so thankful to have her in our department, and she's made all of this possible. So thank you so much, Malika. All right. Enough with the laundry list of little details about the event. I want to hand this over to Annabelle Ibsen. She's also a graduate of UW Sociology, one of our alumnus, and she's joining us from the University of Oklahoma. And we're delighted to have her here to introduce our guest speakers.
Thank you, Loka. So good afternoon and welcome. I'm honored and delighted to be able to introduce our speakers for today's event. So John Gaventa is one of the most influential voices on power and inequality in community development. He's professor and research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. He's authored numerous articles and books in addition to the book that he's going to be talking with us about today. Specifically, his award-winning book, Power and Powerlessness in an Appalachian Valley. This work has profoundly shaped how I and many of us in the room think about power in development, particularly in situations of unequal power. A hallmark of John's work is the way that he connects research and teaching to development practice and social change. A Rhodes Scholar and MacArthur Fellow, he served as the director of the Highlander Center in the US, chair of Oxfam Great Britain, and vice president of the International Development at St. Francis Xavier University in Canada. He received an OBE in 2012, a prestigious award by the monarch for his service to Oxfam. Gabe Schwartzman is a highly accomplished assistant professor in geography and sustainability at the University of Tennessee. He studies rural development and the implications of decarbonization and the coal transition. He is the co-founder of the Institute for Climate and Community Resilience at the University of Tennessee, an affiliate at the Appalachian Justice Center. His publications include numerous articles, as well as his book with John, Power and Just Transitions, Struggles for a Post-Coal Future in an Appalachian Valley. His research and community-engaged work is supported by the Sloan Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the EPA, and the US Department of Energy. And finally, Loka Ashwood, our moderator for today's event, professor at UW-Madison in Community and Environmental Sociology. Loka's research and teaching have been defined by her deep commitment to understanding the challenges faced by rural Americans. So this is evidenced through her work, particularly her award-winning book, For-Profit Democracy, Why Government is Losing the Trust of Rural America, as well as her articles, many of which I teach in my own classes. Loka was awarded the MacArthur Genius Award for 2025 to 2029, the Rural Sociological Society's Excellence in Research, as well as numerous teaching awards. As someone who studies power in meatpacking and corn seed firms, I'm especially invested in learning from Loka's current research on identifying dominant global agribusiness companies and their cross-sectoral ties. So her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the European Research Commission, and the USDA, among others. So please help me welcome these exemplary scholars.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Annabelle, Loka, all of you for coming, being here this afternoon. What a great privilege, first of all, to have this event hosted by Loka's department, who's done profound work over the years, by the Havens Rights Center, to follow the work, the walk in the places that many people who influenced me, Fred Battelle, Jess Gilbert, and others. It's just a wonderful privilege to be back on this campus after about 25 years. Thank you. We've got a very grand title of Shifting Power in Rural America, but we're actually going to be honing in on that by focusing on one place in rural Appalachia where Gabe and I have both worked. And we're going to use that place to look at this broader theme of shifting power. But I don't need to tell this audience, but maybe start with a little bit of setting the context. You, as many of you are aware of rural trends, but we're concerned that our book addresses at least 3 critical trends. One is rising inequality. Inequality is rising across the world. It's particularly rising in the United States. You all know that between 1975 and 2018, 47 trillion in taxable income was redistributed upwards from poor and working class communities to the top 10% of wealthy people in the United States, and much of that wealth was redistributed from rural areas. Rural areas are also a place of economic abandonment. Between 2000 and 2018, prosperous zip codes gained 8.7 million jobs. Poor zip codes, many of which are in rural areas, lost jobs. So decline, that leads to economic decline. And the sense of economic decline in rural areas is far deeper, as we're going to hear, than simply a loss of jobs. It has ripple effects throughout the communities. People write about the hollowing out of heartland America. More recently, of course, we've had concern not just about the economic inequalities of rural America, but the environmental inequalities of rural America. I've just come here from a conference on environmental injustice, and rural areas are often the hardest hit by toxic waste, by destructive strip mining, by other environmental inequalities. 60 to 70% of rural counties contain at least one census tract in the top quartile of the worst environmental justice in the country. So environmental justice it's also present in poor communities and urban areas, but it's widely important in rural areas. And today we add to the older forms of our environmental justice the whole question of climate injustice. We know that oftentimes it's the poor communities and most marginalized who are get the worst effects of climate change, whether it's massive flooding in East Kentucky, whether it's droughts in the Midwest, or other forms of climate change. Now, in the midst of climate change, worldwide, there's a call for a transition away from fossil fuels. And some people call for what's called a just transition. That is to make sure that that transition brings more justice to workers and communities. And that issue you're going to hear about in our discussion of the book is profoundly important for rural America as well. Because many of the fossil fuels that drive the national economy come from mining, oil and gas, wood, other kinds of fracking, other kinds of jobs in rural counties. 64 million Americans, 1/5 of the population, still live in fossil fuel-affected communities, even though hundreds of thousands have lost their jobs in the economic decline of the last 20 years. An example of the impact of this is found in this picture. This is on the Navajo Nation, and it's blowing up the old power plant there, which is good. It's perhaps good to get rid of that, but you have to think about the impact of that in that local community. So with that broader context, let's go get real local in a small Appalachian valley. So 50 years ago, I wrote my dissertation on power and powerlessness in an Appalachian valley. Inspired by Stephen Luke's on theories of power, I explored how a British-based land company took control and built hegemonic power in one small part of rural America. The company was ironically called the American Association, and it was after months of research in our PhD, we discovered that it was part of an international empire held by one of Britain's wealthiest men, Sir Dennis Flowerdew Calhoun Lawson III. In 1922, a few years ago, I returned to the valley thinking that I would like to update my old book with a new chapter or two about what's happened over that 5 decades. I quickly realized that the story I had to tell required far more than a chapter or two. I met Gabe Schwartzman, my co-author, in an interview, and Gabe had just finished his PhD in the same valley that I did mine 50 years before. And so we teamed up to write this book, and it's been a wonderful intergenerational collaboration of how power has shifted in one microcosm of rural America over a 50-year period. And that's what we want to share with you a bit today. This new book is called Power and Just Transitions, because we examine what happens to power when the minds upon which that power system was based are no longer there. And how do communities and workers realize a more just transition in the midst of this decline? So the place I'm talking about is called the Clear Fork Valley. It's a beautiful valley, as you can see. It stretches across 40 miles down a narrow rural valley. Within that are dozens of small former mining towns, which are all pretty much closed down. Once it cuts across 4 counties, so it's the backside of 4 different counties in 2 different states. And so the political inequalities are important there. Once a thriving population of over 20,000, it now is a population of 4,000. It's rich with natural beauty, and within that, beneath those clouds, it's full of citizen action and community resilience. It's located here, as you can see, on the border of Kentucky and Tennessee. But beneath the beauty, we've seen huge job loss and a sense of economic abandonment. Between 1980, mining jobs in this 4-county area dropped by over 90%, from 3,000 to 300. That doesn't sound very much, but you can imagine 3,000 in a rural area is a lot. Today, there are no more mines left in the Clear Fork Valley. And when the mines close in a valley like this, it has more than an economic effect. As one woman told us, and that was sad, the day they pulled out the coal trucks. You know, it reminded me a lot of when my brother passed away. The loss of the mines is a loss of identity. It brings community grief. It's also a loss of tax base in already poor counties. And with the loss of that tax base, you'd have a decline of services. And when you have a decline of services, you have poorer schools. And when you have poorer schools, people start leaving, et cetera. So you'll see it sets off a whole sequence of sort of abandonment effects from just a job. So that's very important to understand. In this setting, we set out to ask this question: what is the impact of transition on places like this, whose history, livelihoods, identities, political and social structures have been shaped for over a year by a largely fossil fuel-based economy? How does power shift when the material base on which it is built declines? You all know the history of coal camps, and this was a former coal camp area. The company owned the mines, the company controlled the jobs, the company controlled the housing. The company sort of, through their political influence, decided who got welfare benefits and who didn't. They built a system of power and hegemony, which still remained when I was there. But we asked the question, what happens when those mines and that whole system closes? One thing it does is leave a vacuum. As one community leader said to us, I'm not sure who has the power now. Is there anybody who has power anymore? I can think of a few people who have. Some have more sway here than others, but nothing like that of the coal company. So what steps into that vacuum in the midst of transition that abandoned communities across rural America and across the world are now facing? Using that one valley, we try to understand these shifts in power. We look at incumbent power. That is how the old fossil fuel actors cling on, even though their mines are closing. We look at what we call emergent power. That is, who are the new actors who step in? What's the basis of their power? And seen here and around the world, and particularly in the rush for so-called green sources of energy, renewables, critical minerals, et cetera, which you will hear about. But we also focus on the possibilities of transformative power. That is, how do workers and communities mobilize in this new opening for more just forms of transition? Now, since it's an academic audience, I'm going to step a little bit into some of the theories that we bring to this, but very, 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 very briefly, because you mentioned the first book of Power, which you developed. We draw upon three schools of power. Now, there's something called transition studies. And transition studies has put forth this fairly apolitical way of understanding technological change. It basically says that you have a broad landscape, and in that broader landscape, certain regimes of power develop, governance regimes. But meanwhile, there's little niches, little alternatives that begin to emerge. In the space of fossil fuels, you might have renewables begin to emerge. And over time, the landscape changes, and the regimes begin to decline, and the new niches rise up. It's a very simple notion that technologies will simply come and go as the landscape changes. And we critique that slightly because it really doesn't say very much about power. If I can skip down a point, we elaborate on that through drawing on Gramsci, as you all know, who wrote a great deal about hegemony. And he talked in his work about the interregnum, which we will come to. The interregnum is the time between hegemonies. It's what happens when old forms of control decline and new ones emerge. And we're going to argue that we, in this valley, and we also suggest in broader rural America, are experiencing a bit of an interregnum between hegemonies. And to do that, we also draw upon my original work with Stephen Luke on the three dimensions of power. Stephen Luke talks about not just the visible power, that is what you can see in the political arena, but he talks about the importance of hidden power, how power keeps certain issues from coming up, how power keeps certain voices from being heard. But he said the most insidious use of power was not simply keeping voices off of the table, it was keeping people from believing that they had a right to a voice in the first place. He wrote about the internalization of powerlessness, in which people accept an unjust status quo as normal, and the normalization through narratives and discourses of inequality is what he talked about. Now, since that book with Stephen Luke, I've elaborated, and you probably can't see it, but I've elaborated and argued that the three dimensions that we looked at were simply one dimension with three parts, and we had to understand those in relationship to two other important dimensions. One is how power works across levels and scale. So what's the relationship between power in the household? Who has power in the local area? How is that affected by power at the national level, even the global level? Because in these days, when in globalization, power is moved beyond territory. You can't simply understand power by understanding power in one place. And as you'll see, you have to understand about what's going on in the global economy. But the Power Cube also says power depends also on whose space we're talking about. A poor person may feel very uncomfortable and powerless in a space that's been created by the powerful, or being invited into somebody else's space where they control the agenda. But meanwhile, they have their own spaces, their own community meetings, their own social movements, their own kitchen conversations, and power relations are very different there. So we say that to understand power these days, we have to look across the interactions of those level spaces and forms, and we try to map what's happening in the valley in relationship to that dynamic. Now, if you're interested, there's a lot written now about the Power Cube. Come to powercube.net, and you can see the many applications of this approach. So we tried to bring to this valley these broader theoretical understandings. I haven't been changing the slides. No, I'm going backwards. That's the problem. Yeah. So we also know that rural areas are also places of extraction. So you can't talk about a just transition for the future without recognizing that there's also a lot of injustices from the past. And then once, by taking a place-based approach, you see how they come together, how they accumulate, and how they intersect. So very briefly, we can see this valley. We can understand it as a valley that's been persistently poor over decades. And despite the War on Poverty, despite the Appalachian Regional Commission, it remains poor. But we can also see it as a place that was the front lines of the opioid crisis. Those of you who have read Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead, imagine communities like this. And the opioid crisis didn't just happen because people wanted to buy drugs. It was a place where poor communities and sick coal miners were intentionally targeted by pharmaceutical companies and became another form of economic extraction for economic reasons. It's also a place of high rates of disability and unemployment. Over 60% of the population is not in the workforce anymore. Many people are leaving. We were told here that the absent middle generation, 60 to 80% of the children live with their grandparents, while the middle generation has either been affected by the opioid crisis and are in recovery centers, or they've had to leave the area, or both. And on top of that, it's a place of, it's a place of huge environmental destruction. You all have all read about, but until you see it, it's hard to imagine. Denuded landscapes, open cast pits, leaving behind a legacy of toxic waste and ruined environment. And all of these things intersect with each other, right? So if you're poor, you don't have access to health. If you don't have work, you don't have access to health. And the loss of jobs are not, the mining jobs are being replaced by other jobs which are far, far different, pay far less. The fastest growing job, according to official statistics in this area, which once was well-paying miners' jobs, is becoming an orderly in opioid addiction clinics, to give you a sense of the contrast. So the lesson from this, that any thought about beginning a transition for the future, just transition for the future, has to begin with a recognition of the injustice of the past in extractive communities. The global trend now towards a just transition, the phrase that was briefly mentioned in the COP Paris meeting, in the meeting COP in Paris, the last meeting COP30 in Berlin, was widely used, but oftentimes it's considered simply a technical matter. A transition is a transition of one form of energy extraction for another, from coal mining to renewables. But no, in situations like this, it's not a matter of just shifting technologies, and it's a matter of shifting power. Political, social, economic power. It's much more complicated. So we ask the question in these kind of settings, with this tradition of extractive, intersecting inequalities, what happens How do the mining companies, the mining industry, the fossil fuel industry, if you can think about this as a microcosm of the broader fossil fuel industry, what happens to them? Well, first is just because the mines have closed doesn't mean their power has gone away. Power has a subjective base, not just a material base. And they've continued, people still think of them as powerful, and they still think of themselves as powerful, and they do their best to cling on to it. So what's the playbook for clinging on to power when you're losing your traditional form of base? 3 things that they've done, which we can see happening nationally. First of all, they did their best to destroy any countervailing power. In this region, the United Mine Workers was once very strong. It was during the 1940s and 50s, probably the strongest union in America. Over the years, that began to decline as the mines began to decline. But over time, the coal industry systematically decided to try to get rid of it by changing forms of ownership, by cutting contracts, by bringing lawsuits, by doing all kinds of things. So basically, the last surviving remnant of the union is an old union hall to which miners with black lung occasionally go for a meeting. But there's no active union of opposition anymore. And that union was the place of information, it was a place of meeting, it was a place of solidarity. That's gone. The second thing is that even as they lose power, the industry does more to shore up their political power. So we have a graph, which I'm not going to show, that shows that as the mine production went down across America, fossil fuel companies contributed more and more and more to legislators, particularly Congress, but also at the state level. Not only did they contribute more to get political control, but they shifted those contributions. They used to hedge both sides of the bet. They give Republicans and Democrats. 99% of those contributions over the last 15 years had gone to Republicans, and within that particularly to climate-denying Republicans. So they did their best to control the rules, the second phase of power, by buying legislatures. But third, and perhaps most interestingly, is they invested more and more in ideological power, or shifting narrative power. There was always in this area kind of a class consciousness. It was the workers in the communities versus these absentee companies. But somehow over time that began to shift. So now it became the worker and the community, and the worker and the company and community were all in this game together. And the problem is these outsiders who are taking away our jobs, taking away our identities. And that didn't just happen by accident. It happened through a highly developed PR, very expensive PR campaign to change the minds of rural Americans about who was responsible for what was going on in their lives. And that used a lot of loaded memes. So there's a big campaign to form the Friends of Coal, bumper stickers, school events, scholarships, all under the name of Friends of Coal. And anybody who was not a friend to attack, raising questions about the industry, even to raise the question about is there life after coal mines, was seen as unfriendly to coal. They used memes such as this one in the middle, which links somehow, it's this very masculine image of the male miner, the woman praying to the cross, and linking all of this to Christianity. And they used violent kinds of image. One of the slogans became, this is the last one, is save a miner, shoot a tree hugger. Anybody who raised environmental concerns, like Gabe, who was fighting the open cast mining that time, was called a tree hugger, and bumper stickers all over the region. Shoot a miner, save a tree hugger. And this kind of ideological messaging had a huge impact. So in a rally in 2009, for instance, miners and their families, hundreds, were chanting, whose coal? Our coal. It's not their coal, it's the company's coal. Whose mountains? Our mountains. It's not their mountains, it's still absentee owned. Whose freedom? Our freedom. Whose America? Our America. And again, we argue in the book that this little micro case study is instructive of what we see now and this kind of globally going on as the fossil fuel industry tries to close down political space, as it tries to buy political power, as it did by giving $10 million to Trump right before the election if he would take away the environmental regulations, as they do by building the ideological messaging that there's no alternative to fossil fuels in the future. So with that kind of background in this region, it wasn't a great step to go from make coal great again, as Trump promised, to make America great again. This region, which in the beginning of 2000, just 25 years ago, was a Union and Democratic stronghold. About 60% voted Democrat. They voted for Al Gore running in the 2000 election. He was an environmentalist and was already talking about climate change. But by 2026, it had completely reversed, even more so. 90% of the votes for Trump, less than that for Democrats. And so we asked the question, like many sociologists and many political scientists have been doing, a lot of words written on this theme. How do we explain this shift in working class political voting over this short period of time? We give three reasons that you can go more. There's nothing. It's hard to explain. But one was simply the absence of alternatives. This area was in economic abandonment, like many rural areas, economic desperation. But who in the national political level was coming in and offering an alternative vision? There hadn't been much attention since Lyndon Baines Johnson and John Kennedy to these poor communities. When Hillary Clinton came in, she talked about putting miners out of work because of climate change and the need to shift, which is important. That wasn't the right message to send there. And along came Trump with a message saying, let's make coal great again. It's part of making America great again. And he came and he donned the miners' hats and he went to the communities. And he was offering a vision, but it wasn't necessarily, it's not the right vision, but it was offering something. So we have to put part of the blame on the neglect of the Democratic Party of rural areas like this to offer a vision. Also, some people write about how people voted as reflecting shame or reflecting illiteracy or whatever. No, these people are mad. We talk about the anger that they feel and resentment that they feel. But anger can be channeled in many ways. And once again, the national rhetoric and the Trump rhetoric and the Make America Great Again rhetoric help to channel that anger, particularly towards immigrants, particularly by constructing this area as a largely white community whose identities were being taken away by immigrants and others, by denying and silencing the rich Afro-American history and now the Latinx history in the region. They constructed a sense of whiteness that was being threatened from outside, and that turned to anger. And all of this worked to shift the conversation from the material inequality, from the economic abandonment, to cultural identities. And we were concerned about gays, we were concerned about abortion, we were concerned about other cultural identities. As one person said, all of this was based on the manipulation of fear. He said, it's a fear factory. It's like the manufacturing of fear. When one fear subsides, it's not marketable anymore, then they just turn to something else. Fear, because fear keeps people in power. So by mobilizing such fear, we argue, right-wing conservative movements began to shape the agenda away from rising inequality, away from economic restructuring, and away from the need for a just transition to the future. So let me carry on to Gabe now, who will talk a little bit about what happened as the mines declined and new actors entered the scene.
Thanks so much, John. And first, thank you all so much for being here. Just to reiterate, really, it's such a pleasure and a privilege to be on this campus and to be talking with you all about this book. So thank you, and thank you to Loka for hosting us. So as John said, John's kind of given us an overview of some of our research on how the coal industry the decline of the coal industry has exerted its own power. We've also documented a rise of new kinds of actors in the Central Appalachian landscape, but with a fair bit of relevance for broader rural America. And here, as coal mines have declined, we've seen a rise of new forms of conservation, particularly for-profit kinds of conservation and climate investing, what we might think of as sustainability impact investing, and what we call economies of abandonment, drawing on Lauren Berlant's work there. But and these are kinds of economies that generate increased profits with less need to locally employ workers or invest in basically nearby communities. And so one example that I want to spend a fair bit of time with here in exploring some of the rise of these new green economies is the Nature Conservancy's Cumberland Forest Project, which was started in 2019. You can see it here in the dark green, and it covers about half of it is in the Clear Fork Valley over there on the left side of the right side of the map, and the Cumberland Forest Project was started by Nature Vest, which is the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy being the largest environmental organization, wealthiest environmental organization in the world, and the largest nonprofit landowner in the world. And Nature Vest is their impact investing arm. And they orchestrated this land deal in 2019 by organizing a private LLC, so a company that's not actually owned by them, but they're the majority stakeholder, and attracting other investors. And we don't know how many or who those investors are, because there's a corporate privacy around that. But we know that they leveraged $130 million to purchase 250,000 acres of largely formerly mine-owned land, or lands that had been owned by companies that were involved in mining. In the Clear Fork Valley, that parcel had been contiguous since John wrote the earlier book. And the American Association, who you just heard about, the British mining company, had owned that very parcel. So the Nature Conservancy came to control the same parcel and the same piece of land that had been the mining company, for the longstanding mining company. And we connect this to a growing literature on green grabbing. And what green grabbing is largely focused on is land deals for climate and green economies that often enclose land or make it more difficult for local people to use that land in different ways. Nature Conservancy in this deal promised to bring dividends for their investors so that they would make money on the land, while also eventually selling it so that the investors could recoup that investment. And these investors are largely sustainability investors, and so they wanted to see both an impact on the climate, they wanted to improve, have climate outcomes, while also getting a return on investment. So how did they get that? How does TNC produce that return on investment? We focus on we found five large revenue flows, or we could actually think of them as rent that's being produced by accessing this land. Carbon offsets is one of the major ones. Carbon offsets, these are both voluntary offsets, and voluntary offsets might be like Delta Airlines has a little button where you can click because you want to lower your carbon impact when you fly. Relatively unregulated, but and very difficult to track. Much easier to track are the regulated offsets for regulatory offsets. And that would be like the California carbon market allows companies to purchase land here or purchase offsets, such as this on Nature Conservancy's property here. And that has brought hundreds of millions of dollars to the region in the sale of offsets from forestry projects. Conservation easements are another form of return on investments. That's largely been selling access to the land here in Clear Fork for hunting agencies, actually. So for the state of Tennessee pays the Nature Conservancy so that they can allow hunters, so they can sell permits to hunt and ride all-terrain vehicles. Recreational leasing is also for riding recreational vehicles on the property. And then timber leases, and it may be counterintuitive that you could be selling carbon offsets from reducing timbers, from basically storing carbon in trees while also timbering, but that is, they practice a kind of sustainable logging that while cutting reduces the overall amount of emissions had they not had those practices. And then the last one is leasing land for renewable energy projects, mostly solar. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this, in 2019, Nature Vest received at least $20 million in futures contracts for carbon offsets on just 100,000 acres of this land. And that's just one of the many contracts on the land itself. So we think of this, and we write about how Nature Vest's investment is part of an overall trend in the financialization of land in rural America, and financialization more broadly in the political economy of neoliberalism. So financialization might be thought of as the growth in banks, lending, and financial services, kind of the investment sectors. And what that looks like in the land context is breaking up land apart into investable asset classes. So that's like, in this case, that means the natural resources. The coal itself could be owned by one owner, the mine owned by another, the forest owned by one entity, and the carbon by another. All of these are investable and tradable. At Central Appalachia, that's led to the rise of ownership of land by timber investment management organizations, TIMOs, which basically are governed by investment portfolios that some of them even that you or I may be invested in through your Advantage account online. And it's, I think, important to note that financialization, what does that really mean when banks own this land? And we think about that as a form of rentierization. That represents assetization of the landscape, turning these aspects of the landscape into rent-bearing assets. So rent is the control of a scarce asset, or a control of a scarce, making something scarce, and then making it investable. So for example, carbon, making it scarce and then making it be able to be sold. So we document that financialization changes the structures of power. And this is important, because what we see is that it removes the locus of power away from the community level. When John was writing the book 50 years ago, the dynamics of power in this landscape and questions of who owns the land and who made decisions about the land were fundamentally questions about antagonisms between workers who lived nearby, workers in the mines, and communities near those mines, and the mine owners and the mine operators. These, at this point, the questions of who owns and who controls and who makes decisions about what happens in this landscape is far away from the community, and much of it happens in a ledger book, a financial ledger book. This brings opaqueness around ownership structures. So whereas John was able to identify who actually owned the land, we don't know, and we're not going to be able to know. Nature Conservancy has actually been incredibly forthcoming, very happy to meet frequently and provide quite a bit of information with us and have dialogue about their project. But they are not legally allowed to let us know who actually owns, who are the investors, and that creates limited accountability. This also perhaps, this kind of financialization of the land has brought limited access for communities. People in the Clear Fork Valley have basically said that they don't think they can access this land anymore. We actually talked to Nature Conservancy. They said they don't need hunting permits and they don't need all-terrain vehicle riding permits to access the land like anybody else, like you or I might need to now that it's been sold for conservation easement and for recreational leasing. But the people on the ground don't actually know. Nobody we talked to knew that. Nobody knew that they were allowed to access it. So they believe that they'd be criminalized if they went on the land without having purchased a permit. And then perhaps, obviously, this means fewer jobs, right? Many of these kinds of economies, for example, carbon, bring new investment, but they don't employ, they actually rely on employing less people. You're cutting less trees, you're employing less people. And many of these jobs are more precarious in that what we see is a growth of contractors. So despite this kind of shifting political economy, in the face of what we're calling economies of abandonment, we see multiple forms of organizing over the last decades where people have been fighting for environmental and economic justice and for a just transition. So one of these is civil disobedience from the 2000s to the 2010s. There was many kinds of protests, sit-ins, lockdowns against mining, and much of it was focused on the reality, as this sign says, that coal was leaving and things like cancer would stay. So it was often structured around the idea that coal was already in decline. There's also demands for accountability. So we see April here, one of our collaborators, testing water, documenting pollution, even as coal shuts down and mines leave, holding the state accountable for environmental remediation and holding the owners of the land accountable. Also, we see building of micro-alternatives, things like establishing farming operations on strip mines, we've been fighting in Clear Fork to build a community-owned solar array, a 1 megawatt solar array that the community could own and a land trust would own. And then visioning for the future. Visioning for the future is often about building plans for what will happen next. So we spent a year working with a bunch of community leaders in Clear Fork on a plan for how to build an outdoor recreation economy that was in juxtaposition to and kind of opposed to the all-terrain vehicle kind of outdoor recreation economy that's been growing there, of people riding basically dirt bikes and ATVs all over strip mines. That's not what people in this community wanted. And all over Appalachia, there's been different kinds of visioning processes to put something forward. That links up with, in 2020, those kind of mobilizations from below, mobilizations for a just transition, linked up with a federal administration interested in environmental justice policy. So 2020 brought in Joe Biden, and with Joe Biden came the Justice 40 initiative, which was an initiative that said that 40% of the federal government's investments should benefit disadvantaged communities that were affected by environmental justice issues. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act were both massive pieces of environmental legislation that were supposed to be the largest investment in climate action in US history. And in Appalachia, and I think for most of rural America, were basically the biggest investment in a generation since the War on Poverty. This money actively prioritized the coal fields. They, particularly with clean energy investments, were supposed to be sited all over the coal fields, and were supposed to target and address concerns of environmental justice. One of the main ways that the funds were supposed to support environmental justice was through community engagement processes, and that 40% of the benefits of BIL and IRA funding were to accrue to environmental justice communities. So what does it mean to accrue? That was the fundamental question that we ended up dealing with here, is that communities didn't have a seat at the table around governing how the money was spent, on what projects, or what the benefits would be. But they would be consulted in the process, they'd be engaged at least in the process of making sure that they knew that they would be getting benefits, potentially 40%, also a nebulous concept. So what we call these cramped spaces. So there was politically very little room for these activists to actually make those claims on resources, or to put forward, to use those resources, the federal, once in a generation, supposedly, investment in the coal fields, to make those investments connected to the visions that they had just been putting forward. And then perhaps, obviously, in this moment of top-down policy meeting grassroots mobilization, Trump closed those spaces very quickly in 2025. And while we know that those spaces were closed, we see this as a Gramscian interregnum, and this is coming back to John's point. So Antonio Gramsci in 1930, sitting in a fascist prison cell, writes, the old is dying, but the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So in a Gramscian framework, he was really thinking, and we engage with this, that hegemony often is about when there are settled political coalitions, where elites build coalitions for ruling, for governance, and the sides of opposition are very clear. The forces, kind of antagonisms are settled and stable. Well, we think, we identified this moment, at least in the coal fields, but we think much more broadly that there's a political conjuncture in between settled periods of hegemony, where clear sides and political alliances are being undone, and there's novel political formations appear to be possible. Particularly despite Trump attempting to shore up fossil fuels and coal, there's really no going back, right? There's much of this infrastructure is not being turned back on. If any of it is being kept on, it's kind of on a lifeline. And we also see new coalitions that are forming. The idea of a just transition is effectively already on the table. Communities have put forward these demands, and they're not going to stop putting those forward. So I think what we want to do is conclude here briefly with some reflections from this research on both power and then also policies for shifting power in rural America. So I'll turn it back over to you, John.
You want to just stay there? So yeah, just very quickly, because we want to hear from Loka. We started with this theme of shifting power. So what are the implications of this micro case for how we shift power, not just in this community and other places? And I think just a summary, I think we've said much of this. First, if we look at dominating power, top-down power, hegemonic power, we learn that even when the material base shifts, those guys continue to fight and to try to cling on. And I think in this hegemonic, this interregnum moment, we're seeing that we're old power elites, we're fighting to hold on, but at the same time, we see new actors, new openings, new kind of ownership also emerging. And with that, the sources of power themselves are shifting. This is no longer power at the coalface, power in those coal camps. This is power that's moved from the local to much more distance. We see the rise not only of financial power, but we see the rise of what we call discursive power, or narrative power, the ability to control the narrative, that third dimension of power, of what change is about and what possibilities of change become even more important than the ability of controlling the workers at the coalface in these modern day forms of power. So what does that mean then about how we transform power? What does it mean for strategies for political action? One, we have to remember that despite these cracks, change doesn't happen automatically. First, it doesn't happen because just as the coal industry tends to hold on, the internalized forms of powerlessness that remain in the citizens who were dominated for 50 or 100 years. And that takes special kind of political education work and consciousness building work and capacity building work to get rid of, first of all, that internalization of powerlessness. That means that there are important strategies of the micro spaces that Gabe was talking about become very important, not just because spaces have changed, but there are spaces of learning for citizens to begin, not using the term citizens very broadly here, obviously, but to redevelop their sense of what's possible and their own capacities to do that. And these microspaces now are joined up. There's the need for new alliances, and the Just Transitions movement offers a broad umbrella now in which labor groups and environmental groups and alternative economy groups and farming groups and are all coming together under a bigger notion. So it means there has to be opportunity for new alliances. And finally, it means an important shift, which has been hard for many groups to make, and some have very consciously made. When you live in a situation of inequality for many years, you spend your time fighting the inequality. It's oppositional to the people in power, to correct their strip mining, to hold them to account for taxes. But when there's this new opening, oppositional power isn't enough. We have to have what we call propositional power. That is the ability to imagine a new kind of world and to put your narrative on the table to counter the dominant narratives. We call that a shift from power over to power for. Power for is what are the narratives from below of what kind of world we want to build in this political opening, and how do we get there? So strategies, and this is very important, from shifting, adding to oppositional power, the ability to imagine a new future. Yay for policies, very quickly.
Yeah, thanks, John. And just to say briefly, I think the big point here is much of our research focused on the way that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act had the potential to bring massive change in power relations and in quality of life. Many of these, what we saw were these were public investments it was publicly invested, privately implemented. What did that mean? Effectively, that private corporations were able to make quite a bit of money off of, ostensibly building the clean energy future and addressing environmental justice concerns. So what I want to put forward as one of the lessons that I've taken away from this research is the question of what if we had public investment that was publicly owned? And that may sound, simple, but it seems like a sea change that would be much needed. What does that look like? Well, for example, if you have a company, if you have investments, like we were handing out $100 million, $80 million here for solar to be built on mine lands, what if that solar was then, as somebody said in an interview, what if the money that was spent on that solar could then be taken off of their bill? What if they paid less in energy because it was a publicly funded energy project? Or what if there was a publicly owned corporation that actually built the solar, right? That requires greater community governance of the funding. That requires greater amounts of control by people who are actually affected by the money that's going to be spent. And I also think one of our takeaways is that the Biden administration slow walked all of their policies and walked on eggshells. We need faster, bigger rural policy.
Last slide.
Thank you so much for that. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. I just want to say I have really enjoyed reading this book. From those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, if you get through the first 2 chapters without choking up a bit, I commend you. I just want to say a few points on a few quick stories that haunted me that I also shared with my family. You'll read in their first chapter after their introduction about fly rock from mountaintop removal, killing a child in Kentucky and killing a child in West Virginia in their homes. One of them was only 3 years old. You'll read about when Gabe asks someone locally what kinds of development they want. We talked about this just yesterday. A man answered clean needles and cash, and then 2 months later he was dead. You'll hear about so many people moving to the north for jobs, but then as soon as they can retire, they go back. And there's also a few other quotes I want to share with you that are equally, if not more important. I wouldn't trade this for a city place, never. I came back home to die. I raise a garden and enjoy the outside of nature. And I think these quotes matter. What rural people want matters. What urban people want matters. And what people want, period, matters, especially for democratic societies. And a society that can understand that people who live on the land are also a measurement of how healthy that land is, how healthy our society is, how healthy our economy is. But it can also be a reflection of those many injustices. So what about this? And John, you called this propositional power, power 4. What if rural communities can have it all? What if we switch the narrative? And that's something we're working on here in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology here at UW-Madison, working towards acre justice. Imagining, what could a future be like? And this is the soft launch of a website that I have to thank APL for, especially Caitlin and Nadia and Raven, and others in Science Hall with the Office of the State Cartographer Office, Howard and Mike. But what if rural communities don't have to feel like they have to sacrifice? If we go at that third dimension of power that John talked about, that internalized idea that I can't have it all. So there is much to do. I work more in agriculture, and there's much to do here in the Midwest and many lessons to be told from coal that can inform how we understand what's happening to agriculture. And those lessons are in John and Gabe's book. But I just want to talk for a moment. You saw the slides with what's happened to coal miners. This is what's happened to farmers across the United States. A similar precipitous decline across sectors. And the one that haunts me the most, especially coming back to Wisconsin after 10 years, are the dairy farm numbers. They're heartbreaking. They passed out hogs in the recent census for the most dramatic decline. But here's something that I think that we can perhaps do, and something that John called for us to do, is we must remember the injustices of the past to build a better tomorrow. I don't know how many of you feel like getting on a device. You probably don't feel like it. It's wonderful not to see you on a device. But if you're so inclined, one thing that we're working on with Howard and Mike at the Office of the State Cartographers is mapping lost rural homes across the country, remembering homes that are now gone. Anybody, if you're interested, you can go to the Acre Justice website. It's live now. You can check it out, this QR code, and you can start mapping a lost rural home that you know of. Mike and Howard have mapped them in Canada because their families have lost rural homes. I've mapped one in Illinois, in rural Illinois where I'm from, and probably a lot of you, even in your research and the people you talk to, you know of lost rural homes. So I'm just going to show you for a moment, if you're interested, This is how you can go to the website. You can explore lost rural homes. You can zoom in, and these are just a few that we have mapped now. This is the soft launch. We're just starting today. But you can also then click, there's hyperlinks here where you can click to map your lost rural home. And I have to also thank Rockford Maps, which is going to be providing us parcel data for all of Wisconsin. We're working with them on that to get parcel data from the 1980s available to help people remember what was there. So if you want to participate now, zoom in, drop a click. You can do it on your phone. You can do it on your computer. You can visit it later on, and you can say, this is what I remember about this home. You don't have to know everything. I left things blank. But this is part of that remembering the injustices of the past, especially for the senior generations that we're losing, that remember so much more than I know. The time is now. Another part of this praxis approach that the Acre Justice Initiative is taking is also thinking about why is there so much loss? John and Gabe have talked so much about the American Association. It's been around a very long time, over a century. Well, it was around over a century. One of my favorite parts of the book is they talk about how the concentration of economic power goes back to English royal charters, which is our precursor to the American corporation that began with the dispossession and the enclosure of the lands that belong to, in your book, you talk about the Cherokee, the Mingo, the Shawnee. This dispossession hasn't left us. The corporation hasn't left us. So the American Association really by effect maintained colonial rule in America despite what we consider to be a revolutionary war. And corporations continue to maintain control over people, as John and Gabe write in your book. I love this in the context of coal, through the control of land, through the organization of the company town, local politics, we can understand that in agriculture, a racialized hierarchy of work. You can think about farm workers and farm laborers versus farmers, how we talk about them so differently and erase some and not others. And the gendered labor structure of the coal mines. You can think about that with agriculture too. So we would do well to consider these matters together in agriculture, like you do provide us so many lessons of coal in Appalachia. But there's something else new that's going on that Gabe brought up. It's financialization, but it's also this quote in the book, Barbara Ellen Smith, who you write about. She talks about venture capitalists have increasingly fractured the coal industry, making it unstable even as they make more money. We have a fracturing of American agriculture happening now too. Almost like we could call this a fractured corporate power. It's fracturing, it's diffusing, but it's consolidating at the same time. So we're working on a project, and again, I want to thank especially Caitlin with APL for this. We've been collecting this data for 3 years. There's a lot of folks involved, but we invite you to interact with the scale of consolidation on the Acre Justice website, to pull back the curtain, to see just how extensive which you could say legally is collusion, but the overlapping ownership between even these massive agribusinesses that we think of globally as distinct actors acting across the world. So again, if anyone has a device ready and you want to start playing yourself, you can explore the network online and you can search by a firm that you might be interested in. We picked the 47 largest in 9 sectors, and we started to try to look behind the curtain. So when you start to look behind the curtain, you can look at people involved. You can look at other firms that are involved, those LLCs, like Gabe was talking about. That's the primary American one of interest. You can look by country, or you can search by name, for those of you who are researchers. You know, we found in our research that Cargill, out of the 47 agribusiness we looked at across 9 sectors, is the most powerful in terms of relationships. This surprised us. I thought it would be the agrochemical industry, but they are the largest private company in the United States. A lot of people don't know this. Big tech, big pharma. No, you can check Forbes' list. They've been the largest for the last 37 of the 38 years. They had a revenue of $154 billion last year. Phenomenal amounts of money. A lot of folks don't know that. So you can open up Cargill and you can start to look at why they're so large, who their relationships are in terms of other firms and people. Caitlin's made this great interface that you can then go back and you can add on other firms that you might be interested in. Maybe you're interested in chemicals. Maybe you're interested in cattle. We really hope that farmers in rural communities can use this. But then you can see at the bottom who has what relationships with who. Already, for those of you in ag, you may be surprised to see that Mosaic, one of the largest fertilizer companies, has relationships to Cargill through this actor, Emery Koenig, who's a director of Cargill, who has been a director of Cargill, but also a shareholder in Mosaic. So these are the sorts of kind of interesting relationships that we can begin to understand. Now, I think I have on this video, we'll go back for a moment, return to search, and maybe you want to add on another company, Land O'Lakes, also often considered to be one of the largest grain companies in the world. You might be surprised to see that it has relationships to Cargill, considered largely to be a competitor. And you can, again, zoom into these nodes to see what kind of relationships tie these firms together. So the idea of this, and inspired from John and Gabe's approach, is that we can see who holds control. And if we can understand who holds control, we can maybe change it more so. And as this material control wanes, as John has talked about in his comments, maybe there's a moment to also disrupt the ideological control that has been seated in the third dimension of power. So I'm going to show just a few other things. When you scroll back on this, you may want to look at a different sector when you go to the website. You can go down. One example, we have the most cattle farmers remaining in the United States out of all farmer types. Most of these are small grass-fed herds that then sell from their cow-calf operations to feedlots. They can look and see the main actors that are involved in cattle production. And again, we hope that this is a tool that people can use to help disrupt, but also to maybe capitalize on this moment of disruption. So I encourage you, if you feel like it, check out the Acre website. You can share. You can also look by nation. The nation with the most ties out of any in the world is, you'll probably guess, which one? Does anyone want to guess? The most people involved, the most firms involved. It takes the longest to load. It's the US. It's the United States. So you can pull up the United States, and you'll have this happen sometimes when you pull it up. It's going to take a long time to load. So you may get that a little bit too. So I guess at this point, I would love to stop and open this up to questions and discussion, but also if you need any help or you have issues using this tool, or also are trying to track down a particular corporation or entity that's in your community and you don't know who the owners are, we can try to help. But like Gabe says, especially in the context of financialization, this tool only goes so far as well. Thank you. So I think we can open it up to questions and discussions. Anybody have a question?
Thoughts, yeah.
Is it? I'll give the microphone.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys and lady. It was a great presentation. My question is, you guys talk about internalized powerlessness. And in psychology, that would probably be called learned helplessness. And there's a difference between powerless and helpless. Is there any work in your field to help flip that relationship, take people who have learned helplessness and reactivate them through some sort of, therapy or action? Is there any effort being done to take these people who have learned to sit by the sidelines and re-engage in the life of their community and the economic life, economic sovereignty of their community?
I think one of the most important lessons that I've learned is that people who have been taught not to feel their own power and taught to feel helpless, in order to break that cycle, you have to start with an action they can imagine. And that's the importance of small steps. As social change activists, we come in and say, look, and I did this when I was 50 years ago. I came in, I was shocked at all the inequalities I saw, and my book was, why didn't people act? And the first community project in that community, they asked people, what do they need? And they said, well, we need to pick up the garbage on the highway. I said, what? You know, look at all the garbage that's destroyed your mountains. That was out of their lens of thinking. And Paulo Freire writes about this. He calls it the limit act. He said, people can only act upon what they imagine. That's the limit of their action. But once they take that step and gain some confidence, they can imagine something else. And so my feeling is that those limit acts multiplied and multiplied and multiplied means that small steps move to larger footpaths, move to larger roads, lead to bigger change. But that means that you have to unite the small actions and build coalitions horizontally, not just leave it to the individual.
So just following up on what John just talked about, so beyond the depressing revelation of what do you want, clean needles and cash, what is it that people in this community want? You've asked them all, I assume, in different ways. What are the small actions that they could take action and begin to build in the way that John suggests? And I obviously haven't read the book. This may all be in the book.
Thanks, Joel. Sure, yeah, Joel, thanks for that. Yeah, you know, we don't spend too much time in the book really detailing, which I think there should be a book at some point that just details what do people want to see in a just transition. We spend a lot of time in the book talking about the kind of the impediments to the visioning processes. Yeah, we conducted a community asset mapping project in the community in 2018 to 2020. You know, and a lot of that was very participatory, asking people what they wanted to see. The mines were shutting down at that moment. All the mines shut down in 2020. And you know, we could show you some visuals, but you know, I mean, what people, the first thing they wanted to see was activities for their kids to do. They want things for young people, because there's not that many, there's like none, right? And they want opioid addiction services. And then the third thing is jobs. I think importantly for me, as you know, kind of a geographer who's very interested in feminist social reproduction theory and kind of feminist theories of labor, I think it's notable that jobs is not the first thing, right? It's not that people want to be reemployed or even that reemployment is on the mind. Many of the people who would have gotten a job have left. So I think that gives you a sense of that, but I actually think it's a much harder question than it gets treated, of saying, what do people actually want to see in your community? I think any one of us, if you said that to us, you know, we would give you a kind of an array of different answers that range from like, I want a better ice cream stand to, you know, fully automated luxury communism, right? And these are, so you find yourself, I think we find ourselves in, at least for me in the ethnographic project, kind of trying to parse what, you know, what do you do with the fact that we have really disparate thoughts on what we want? Just to conclude though, I think what's very clear is that people want nice things in their community, right? And that illustrated by things like activities for young people to do. Everybody wants a nice coffee shop. Everybody wants to be able to go shopping. Everybody wants to be able to get outside, have health care, have good schools. So I think that's what's arisen out of, you know, perhaps obviously out of all of these community engagement processes, is basic quality of life concerns arise, often in my experience, before employment. So I don't know if that helps.
Okay. No, I think there's been a long tradition there of both asking the question, what do you want, but also asking the question, what do you value? And if you ask people what you value, they talk about land and community, or land and relatives. And most of the planning for just transition doesn't start with how you protect those values. They start with some other outside values and impose them down. But there's been a lot of work now, even since I was there and continued through Gabe, still small scale, but trying to help people hold on, work in the space that they have. This space has one of the first rural land trusts in America. And it's small. It has 20-odd houses on it. It's now doing its own recreational paths. They're trying to build solar power. Doesn't sound big, but when you look at the symbolic power in a place where it's surrounded by absentee landlords, which now increasingly people feel criminalized if they walk on their land, it's big. So I think there's a lot of people have been working on trying to start with the community visions and build them up. And throughout the Appalachian region, during this period when there was a critical shift from, one of the key organizers we interviewed said, we realized that organizing against the industry wasn't enough for us anymore. We had to start organizing for our own vision. And they held hundreds of visioning exercises, a whole coalition groups throughout the region. Highlander Center, where I worked, did a big visioning exercise with workers and communities about what does a transition look like to you? And of course, the answers were they couldn't separate transition from dealing with racism, from dealing with gender issues, from dealing with all these other embedded inequalities. It's not simply an add-on that you can just put on top of everything else.
I'm just wondering about this mapping of the consolidation and the new economic distribution. And now that you have that done, you can already do the next stage, which is to think about this aspirational part of well, what do we want the economy to look like? What do we think the structure of the economy should be if all we see are these relationships that show concentration of power and increasingly distant power? How as a community can we imagine it to look where it would re-inhabit those lost houses? Can you add a thing on your form for the lost houses to say, what would the people that move back in be doing in your community? Or I guess I just am trying to link the aspirational visioning to this kind of grim mapping of the consolidation.
I was thinking about that actually today on the way here. I was thinking, maybe that we should also have preserved rural homes on that map. And then I was, the mapping folks probably said it's too long of a survey, it's too much to get people just to do this one thing. And that's a technical answer to something that's much bigger. And so I hear you. I think one thing about the network that we show, it's based off of scraping public documents that determine basically what the priorities are of the corporations that rule not this country, but many others across the globe. Let's just change what the papers ask for. I know this seems like very blasé, but if it really is this center place of where so much destruction is coming from, what if they can't incorporate in the same way? What if it's not the same limited liability firewall? What if they have to come into a community, have a certain investment structure, if they even come in at all? So I think we can just change corporate structure. It sounds very simple. Just do that, right? Let's just do that. Well, change it in Delaware, change it in Wisconsin, change it in Illinois. Do it on a state-by-state basis. A lot of what we scrape in the United States is from Secretary of State's offices. That's where we're getting it from. But ultimately, like Sarah, the people should choose what those documents what people want gets to go into those corporate documents. So I think there's a lot of community organizing, community asset mapping principles that are in this book that would be great places to start on what those corporations have to do if they're going to be located there, and not just in the US, but in many other nations. You're like, yeah. You're like, it's there. Go ahead. Yeah.
So you may have answered a bit of this in your response to Sarah, but I'm curious, what was the catalyst for you to create this power analysis of the corporate sector? And what do you hope happens as a result of having done it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So just like I was listening to Gabe tell the story of the LLC that first came in as part of Nature Conservancy, and I noticed the structure in the book that you talked about. There's a Tennessee LLC, there's a Kentucky LLC, there's Nature Vest is the private equity fund. I first ran across this in communities that I was working with. They didn't know who these LLCs were that were coming in. They were innocuously named in hog production, Shamrock Acres, Olive Branch LLC, and then down in Burke County, Georgia, black farmers were dispossessed by Southern Company via other, like Eagle Point LLC. They didn't know that it was Southern Company that was acquiring their land. So that's how my initial interest in this came to be. So there's a lot of flaws with this tool that we could talk about because it's from the top down. It's not from the bottom up. And it's not going to answer some of those questions that communities have. It's not going to have the latest LLC that pops up. So what do I hope would happen with this? And I think we have a lot of hopes. There's been a huge team of people working on this. Muhammad Khalilian, University of Kentucky, Andy Pilney. I think they have different hopes of what it could do because they're more quantitative than me. Probably that's part of the reason. I think it can challenge the way we conceptualize things like antitrust. Like we have really narrow market parameters for market power. We have these silly CR4 ratios that are just within one sector. But yet, all of these entities are owning and acting across sectors. And we're not even that general. We're even more specific. It's culled cows. It's not even beef markets. So that's the kind of things that I think on a pragmatic level, it could help with policy, but really a praxis basis for communities and farmers to access this right away to maybe stop having so much self-blame. I think that's the most immediate use of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John and Gabe. And as someone who read the two books, I think everybody should read them, really. And thank you so much for writing it, too.
You get the prize. You read both.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. But no, I bet Loka probably read more of your work than I did. But but at the risk of like just you know, making a boring kind of observation after this really rich talk, I was wondering about the term transition, energy transition, because it places, at times at least, it looks, and in the book too, it looks like coal sometimes appears as the like kind of the material anchor, right? Whose decline reshapes power relations. And it seems it's central in what makes up our power relations or how we understand power relations. And here, which means that we take the coal as a very specific, discrete material object that somehow relates to everything around it and then constitutes an order, some sort of a socio-political order. And that the transition then is affected, we move to solar, and then solar will be the anchor for that kind of power relations. And here, I mean, I think this is about ontological kind of understanding of coal. And I was wondering, if so, I mean, I wonder how many, because at the same time there are so many, I mean, it seems like there is a center of power, or at least a material center for that power. And I usually don't think that way in the sense that there are so many distributed elements in relations of power. There are churches, there are scientists, there are engineers, there is so much knowledge production, and there is so much enticement, right? Power is not only about, about forcing people or doing something bad, but it also entices people to do things. So for example, people who move from these communities, some of them move because they are poor, but some of them move because they are enticed to move, right? And so I prefer, for example, usually to think of power as a field of relations, right? Where there are so many changes at all the time that are happening, and coal is one of the aspects of those relations. If you think of that, all the jumble that I have given you, how would that change our understanding of relations of power, like you say it, and that you actually, I mean, very well said. I mean, I really loved it, so yeah.
Well, I'll say, thanks so much for the question. I think it's a really great engagement, and it's something we certainly discussed in the book of like how much is coal, or like when we write at times a material base of power, right? How material is material, right? And I think what we hope, at least I hope in the book comes through, is that we see it as as part of a larger field of power. Like I think, but we do see a decline, that maybe not coal itself, right? Like the materiality of coal, certainly not, but we see a decline of the coal industry as being less of a power actor. I think we fully, I think we both agreed, like power is a distributed field of many different actors, in these assemblages. But it certainly is declining in the last 50 years, right? Like from the industry itself was in that field a much larger player than it became. And that's what I think we're trying to document, is that there are larger and smaller aspects of these kind of power fields. That's at least my thought, right? Like I think coal is, there's an ontological relation. It was very material of like when someone's job was reliant on extracting it, and then when your job is, when increasingly you have less and less miners, and all of those the field of power shifts. So coal becomes a much smaller piece of that field. That's what I would say. But yeah, I think we do see there was a material relation, certainly, and then we see that erode, I guess, is what I would come to, if that, I don't know if that answers the question, John.
Well, I think there's an important difference between company towns, let's just use that, where power is not, all those aspects of power are not terribly distributed, right? The company town became the place of social relationships. It's where you shopped. The healthcare system was there. The churches only survived because the companies allowed them to have a piece of their land, and what they taught was about, how not to upset the coal companies, right? And if they taught different, if they preached differently, they were elsewhere. They were booted out. So power wasn't distributed. It was multifaceted in social, political, economic, and cultural life, but it wasn't distributed. It had a more central source. Contrast that to places where they are trying to undergo transition from a more distributed base already. So for instance, in Germany, there's a very entirely different system of transition that's happening. Now that was a place where there was still strong unions. It was a place where the unions and the companies together had a history of working together. They had already started visioning a new future. They didn't have the same concentration of domination of relationships in one place. And they were able to make that the change in a much different, more democratic, more just kinds of way. The problem is most extractive economies were built around a concentration of power in local hands. And you don't see that distributed power that we like to think about more broadly. The other point I just want to pick up is you're right, there's a lot of concern now about the use of transition, because what you may see is a transition of technology, but not a transition of power. And many people who started, no longer want to use this phrase. We should be talking about transformations, not just transitions. And for instance, we do a lot of work now in communities across the world where lithium mines, for instance, are coming in the race for critical minerals, and they're simply reproducing old forms of power, operating the same way in new places with new mines. And I interviewed a woman, an energy activist in Zimbabwe, who for years fought against the coal mines and extractive economies in Africa. And now all of a sudden they see the largest lithium mine in Africa springing up. And they're calling it just transitions, right? And she said there's nothing just when you simply transfer the same extractive model from one field to another.
Okay, I'm gonna, we have one last quick question because I know everybody's hungry and we're a little past end time, but if people want to start moving back to get food and looking at Gabe and John's book, that would be fabulous. Leopold's is still back there, but Lola, can you give our last question?
Hola? Yes, okay, thank you. I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more about, you did visioning exercises with the community, and I guess I was wondering who is included, right? Because you kind of in passing mentioned immigration, and we know the Appalachians have like a smaller percentage of immigration than other spaces, but a growing one. And I was wondering, like, who gets to be part of the visioning of the community, and if, you know, how the clashes are happening, which I'm sure are happening regarding cultural identities that are shifting, but maybe those folks are also revitalizing some rural areas. And like I was thinking about Loka taking over houses that had been abandoned, etc. So I don't know, maybe you wanted to say a little bit more about that. And the other thing I wanted to hear a little bit more was about how the use of SRT kind of changed your approach to the field and to your analysis. The social reproduction theory, how that like inform, I guess, how you were thinking about your field work.
I can talk about the question of inclusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in Clear Fork, so Clear Fork is a very small community. Like the book, right, is really about this one community that is basically 100% white, and it's 4,000 people, right? Like it's and the book is also about obviously the Appalachian region. We focus on other places. And we talk about the histories of racial dispossession, right? It wasn't always 100% white. Like particularly, there was a black mining town that, and the questions of what did racialized and particularly anti-black dispossession happen, and largely through you know the coal industry closed for black miners first and black mining families, right? Like deindustrialization was led through as a racialized process. But your question of like who's involved in the visioning, right? Like in our visioning, it was 68 families and people. We just like knocked on people's doors, and that is, you know, has its benefits, has its merits, and has its limits. Of like basically where are you able to do that kind of engagement, getting people out to like go and do that. There has been a lot of engagement, and I think you're right. Like what I'm hearing you say is like there's Latinx geographies in Appalachia that may be overlooked, and I think particularly I'm struck in the future to think about the like Central American and Guatemalan, particularly like immigrant communities that have come to the mountains for various reasons, but a lot of them in like fleeing genocide, right, and coming to what became like a manufacturing hub of the New South. And that is not that gets left out of a coal transition story, but it's certainly articulated to the story of coal transition, of like new investment, new capital moving through. I can wrap up and just say, I think there's a lot there, but no, we didn't include them. And I think they do I think the Latinx geographies get left out all the time. And I think that giving land to Guatemalan Highlanders in Appalachia is a great idea. That's the best transition idea I've heard yet.
Yeah, great question. We can talk about more afterwards. But the development of this image of a white region was a political act that erased the strong history of African American and also now Hispanic Latinx communities there. But not in this particular valley, but there's been some fantastic work to recreate that history and to create African American history museums and culture within the old coal towns, so that we don't think about it as simply a white place, and therefore you deconstruct this notion of a white person who is threatened by a non-white person. And in the midst of this area that's constructed as racist, there's also lots of everyday acts of solidarity. Just two quick stories to end. And we interviewed one guy, and he takes care of the cemetery of the black coal camp that was there. Oh, it was one, a white coal camp, black coal camp across the street from each other. They had the same cemetery. He said, but all the black graves are on outside of the fence. He said, but I'm the caretaker, so I just moved the fence. And that to me was just such an example of kind of a small act of resistance to challenge the racism by an ordinary white guy there who just said this isn't right and took a small act. And you see a lot of those small acts of resistance now occur in solidarity occurring throughout the region.
Thank you so much for joining us. Please come get some food and check out the books and get a goodie bag. Thank you.